Good rhetorical scholars make arguments which help us understand the meaning of persuasive acts and also help us understand how those persuasive acts might be influencing their audience. Now, when you hear that term argument, you might think of negative things like people yelling and fighting, but there's actually a more productive way to think of argument. So let's take a moment to unpack that definition. In a more basic definition, we can think of argument as the practice of providing evidence and reasoning to support or oppose a particular claim to an audience. Now, that definition packs in a lot of other terms, so let's unpack it and learn a little bit more about each part of the argument. The first part is the claim, and the claim is the proposition or the idea that the arguer wants the audience to believe after the argument is made. So if you're trying to talk with somebody about how it's going to rain today, your claim is just that, right? It is going to rain today. I'm trying to prove to you that it is going to rain. The next part of the argument is just the evidence or the data or the supporting material that the arguer has to try to convince the person of the claim. And so if we're thinking of that instance of it raining, the person might have a weather report or be able to show on their phone a weather report that says it's going to rain. And so that would be their evidence to support the claim. The next part is our reasoning process. The reasoning is the logical support between the evidence and the claim. So imagine someone asked you, how does that evidence prove or justify that claim? And the answer is your reasoning. Your reasoning is your explanation of why that evidence should be used and should be considered when we're trying to decide if the claim is correct. And so in the case of our is it going to rain idea, it might be that we should trust experts because they're more likely to be correct about what's going to happen with the weather. Or it might be that, right, our weather person is really good at predicting what's going to happen, and so we've always trusted this person, let's trust them again in this moment. And so that's a basic understanding of argument, but how does that understanding of argument relate to rhetorical research? And the key is that rhetorical research is about analyzing texts. And good analysts make arguments. They provide us with a claim, evidence, and reasoning to support their interpretation of what is going on. Those good analysts develop arguments that help us understand what's happening, interpret what's happening, and evaluate what is going on. And so think of a football commentator for a moment. Now, if you're like me, you're going to need that football commentator to help you really understand what's going on and why things are happening the way that they are in the game. And so one of the things that commentators do is make arguments about the play that deconstruct the play and tell us how that play worked to help the team advance the ball. And so if a team just had a really great play that they got a touchdown, the commentator can go through and say, this player did this player did this player did this, and that allowed the team to do this thing. And so they help us see all the parts, how they're moving, and how that led to an effective play. Likewise, good rhetorical critics can make arguments that unpack the text to explain how that they are working to influence an audience. So take an example like Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. You could go through as a critical analysis or rhetorical analysis and think, okay, what are the different parts here? What is King doing throughout this letter to help him build a persuasive argument? Are there instances of repetition, biblical allusion? How is he developing his character and credibility? All of those things can go into unpacking King's letter to help us understand more deeply how it is an influential and persuasive text. Now, football commentators might also make arguments about how the team could be improving what they are doing, either in that play or in the whole game. And this is what I call backseat quarterbacking, right? They're giving advice about how the team can perform better, whether it's they should be passing the ball more, or that this particular person on this play needed to do this instead to make that play work. In other words, they give us a deeper understanding about how to be more effective, or how the team could be more effective in that play. Again, rhetorical critics can do something very similar, and that is they can become more of a coach, saying here is what the text did, and here are the places that the text could have improved to be more persuasive. And so perhaps a critic might ask, hey, this person relied on a narrative. Was that the correct choice? Or this person used this metaphor, and did that metaphor actually help or hurt them in terms of persuading or influencing their audience? The next thing that football commentators do is explain when there is penalties or a flag on the field. And so they might describe, here's what the penalty is, and here is why the player did that, and here's why it's unethical or harmful or against the rule, and what the consequence of that might be. But we also know there's debates about whether or not a penalty actually occurred. Was that person actually holding on to that other person? And so we might have to develop an argument or rationale for us to view that particular instance, that penalty, in a certain way. Now, rhetorical critics can also throw flags, and this is when they want to highlight that there is unethical or harmful communication practices occurring. And so the critic can ask, what did the text do, and why might that be considered harmful? For example, maybe someone used a bunch of ad hominem attacks. They just attacked somebody as opposed to developing their argument. The critic might say, flag on the field, we shouldn't be using ad hominem attacks, calling people names in order to help us advance our argument. Likewise, someone maybe uses a slur of some sort in their speech, and then the critic might say, hey, we should not be using those slurs. That causes harm to people when we do use those slurs. I also wanted to highlight that both football commentators and rhetorical critics might engage in their own kind of advocacy. For example, a football commentator, if they see that there's repeated penalties around a certain thing and that thing can actually cause a lot of harm, perhaps it will cause concussions or can cause concussions, the commentator might argue, hey, we should probably have a more severe penalty for that so it doesn't keep happening. Likewise, if a rhetorical critic constantly sees people using logical fallacies like personal attacks, that rhetorical critic might advocate, hey, we need to use different kinds of communication other than logical fallacies to prove our point, and here's what we could talk about instead of using those logical fallacies. And so there you have it, the basic kind of arguments that a rhetorical critic might be making. Now that you know those arguments, let's learn a little bit more about why we're trying to develop those arguments and what the purpose of making these arguments is. And that will be our next lesson.